What do you think was worse, being hanged by the neck until you slowly strangled in front of a jeering crowd, or being erased from history altogether? For female pirates, the answer was often both. Their trials were rigged, their punishments cruel, and their names buried. But here's the part nobody talks about. When women turned pirate, the empire made sure their deaths were unforgettable and their lives invisible. Imagine standing in a sweltering colonial courtroom where every eye already condemns you. The air is thick with sweat and salt, the walls echo with the shuffle of naval boots, and the so-called judges wear expressions carved from stone. These weren't courts of fairness, they were theaters of empire. In the 17th and 18th centuries, piracy was already punishable by death. But for women, the crime was treated as something unnatural, almost an abomination. The Admiralty courts in Jamaica, New Providence, and London didn't just see a pirate on trial. They saw a woman who had broken two taboos, defying the crown and defying her gender. There were no juries, no real chance of appeal. Testimonies came from ship captains, naval officers, and sailors trembling at the thought of being linked to piracy themselves. The outcomes decided long before the accused ever opened her mouth. And yet, this is where two names thundered through history: Anne Bonny and Mary Read. In 1720, shackled and weary, they were dragged before the court in Spanish Town, Jamaica. The verdict was inevitable: guilty, death by hanging. But here's the moment the court never forgot. Anne Bonny turning to her condemned lover Calico Jack, spitting words sharper than any cutlass. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Their only defense was something called pleading the belly, pregnancy. One of the rare shields women could raise against the gallows. For Bonny and Read, it bought time, but not freedom. For most female pirates, even silence became a verdict. Their stories ended before they began. And here's the part nobody talks about. If the courtroom didn't kill you, the gallows would. And the gallows were waiting at one of the most infamous places in all of Britain. The River Thames looked calm that morning. Too calm. Its surface rippled like glass as thousands crowded the shoreline at Wapping, mothers clutching children, sailors jostling for a better view, hawkers shouting as if execution were entertainment. But this was no ordinary spectacle. This was Execution Dock, the stage where the British Empire turned pirates into warnings. Under the Piracy Act of 1698, the law was brutally clear. All and every person so offending shall suffer pains of death. That meant men, women, anyone who dared fly the black flag. Once condemned, prisoners were dragged from Newgate Prison in a cart, their hands bound, their necks already fitted for the noose. Crowds spat insults, threw rotten food, jeered at their shame. But the real horror came on the gallows. Unlike land executions, these hangings weren't designed to be quick. No clean drop, no mercy. Instead, the rope pulled tight and slow. The marshal's dance, they called it. Bodies convulsed, legs kicking desperately as the crowd watched every agonizing second. Even female pirates weren't spared. In 1729, Mary Critchett, an American woman who had joined a crew of escaped convicts, was captured near Virginia. Tried in Williamsburg, she was sentenced without delay, with no plea of pregnancy to shield her. No fame, no reprieve. Just a noose and silence. The ritual didn't end with death. For the worst offenders, bodies were left hanging until 3 tides rolled over them. Sometimes they were tarred and gibbeted, suspended in iron cages along the riverbank, grim silhouettes warning sailors of the Empire's wrath. Here's the part nobody saw coming. The gallows weren't always the final stop. For many women, the whip came before the rope, and the whip had a cruelty of its own. Before the noose ever touched their necks, some women felt the bite of the whip. And make no mistake, the whip was designed not just to punish, but to humiliate. Imagine the docks on a blistering afternoon, the smell of salt air mixing with sweat, the buzz of a restless crowd waiting for blood. A guard steps forward with the cat-o'-nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, each strike tearing skin like claws. When the first lash cracked through the air, the sound silenced even the rowdiest onlookers. Flesh split, blood welled, and the message was carved into the body itself. This is what happens when a woman dares to defy the empire. Sentences could run from a dozen strokes to 100, depending on the court's whim. And unlike private punishment, flogging was theater. Women and children were brought to watch, their gasps and cries fueling the fear authorities wanted. Female pirates weren't just criminals, they were transformed into cautionary tales, their agony a lesson etched into the memory of everyone present. Not every woman who sailed under the black flag met the gallows or the lash. Some endured something even darker, a fate that didn't end in a public spectacle, but in silence.
In the bustling ports of the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Americas, captured women were often diverted away from courts and execution docks. Instead, they vanished into private hands. Some became concubines to colonial officials or merchants. Others were forced into domestic servitude, absorbed into plantations, or sold as property. For Black and Indigenous women, the assumption was automatic. They weren't treated as pirates at all, but as spoils of war. Imagine the scene in Cartagena or Portobello. A captured ship dragged into harbor, its crew shackled, the women separated from the men. No trial, no defense. Just a ledger where their names became numbers and their lives became currency. To the empire, they weren't rebels, they were commodities. The records are hauntingly silent about individual fates. Unlike Anne Bonny or Mary Read, most of these women never left behind dramatic quotes or courtroom transcripts. They were erased, folded into households or plantations, or sold as property. For Black and Indigenous women, the assumption was automatic. They weren't treated as pirates at all, but as spoils of war. Imagine the scene in Cartagena or Portobello. A captured ship dragged into harbor, its crew shackled, the women separated from the men. No trial, no defense. Just a ledger where their names became numbers and their lives became currency. To the empire, they weren't rebels. They were commodities. The records are hauntingly silent about individual fates. Unlike Anne Bonny or Mary Read, most of these women never left behind dramatic quotes or courtroom transcripts. They were erased, folded into households or plantations, or sold as property. For Black and Indigenous women, the assumption was automatic. They weren't treated as pirates at all, but as spoils of war. And that silence is its own cruelty. Execution was loud and final. Slavery was quiet and endless. One death terrified the crowd, the other erased you from memory. But even this wasn't the only fate. For some women, death came not in a marketplace or at a gallows, but on the rotting decks of prison ships, where the empire let its enemies waste away, unseen and unheard. Not every sentence ended with a rope or a whip. For some women, death crept in slowly, hidden behind the wooden walls of floating prisons. Picture a decommissioned warship, stripped of sails, chained to a harbor in Portsmouth, Plymouth, or Kingston. The vessel no longer carried cannons or glory, only misery. Shackled below deck in cramped, airless holds, prisoners lay in the dark, where the smell of rot and human waste clung to the timbers. The groan of the hull mixed with the rasp of coughing, typhus, dysentery, smallpox sweeping through the ranks. Women thrown into these hulks suffered doubly. Starvation gnawed, disease devoured, and many endured exploitation at the hands of guards and sailors. Yet history barely whispers their names. Official records list numbers, not lives. Where Anne Bonny left behind biting words and Mary Read left behind a legend, countless others left behind nothing but silence. And that silence was the point. The Empire wanted them forgotten. Execution dock created fear in the streets. The prison ships created absence, a quiet erasure where death came slowly and invisibly. For the Crown, both outcomes served the same purpose, to remind the world that piracy, especially by women, would not be forgiven. But here's the question. History still refuses to answer. What does it mean when the voices of these women are erased, when their punishments are remembered, but their names are not? Who controls the story of power, justice, and rebellion? As the Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. And in the silence of prison ships, in the shadow of gallows, we're left with a chilling reminder. Some of the most dangerous crimes in history were not committed by pirates, but by the empires that erased them. So what do we make of all this? The gallows at execution dock, the screams swallowed by the Thames, the forgotten bodies rotting in floating prisons. It wasn't just about punishing pirates. It was about controlling the story. The Crown needed to prove that rebellion would be crushed, that women who dared to defy power would not just be killed, but they would be erased. And yet, centuries later, here we are, still whispering the names of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Legends that slipped through the cracks of empire, haunting the very system that tried to silence them. Their voices remind us of a truth the British Empire couldn't bury. Fear may silence people in the moment, but stories have a way of rising from the depths. Now picture this. Next time you're near a quiet harbor, the water lapping against the pier, imagine the creak of ropes, the ghost of chains rattling on old timbers. That sound, it's history speaking. It's every voice the Empire tried to drown, coming back to demand that we remember. And here's the part that matters most. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to keep alive. You're watching this right now because the silence didn't work, because stories are stronger than fear. So tell me, do you think Anne Bonny faked her death to escape, or was she truly lost to history's silence? Drop your thoughts below, because the truth about these women may still be out there, waiting to be uncovered. Piracy's golden age ended long ago, but the echoes of those trials, floggings, and executions never really left us. They live on in the way we talk about outlaws, in how we judge who gets remembered as a hero and who gets erased as a warning. Think about it. The men who wrote the laws called piracy unnatural for women. But what's more unnatural? Defying empire, or a system built on silencing anyone who doesn't fit its mold? Every gallows at Wapping, every lash of the cat of nine tails, every prison ship rotting in the harbor, it was all designed to erase them. Yet, here we are, centuries later, still speaking their names. which means every time we say their names, we're breaking the silence that empire tried to seal shut. And maybe that's the real legacy. Piracy wasn't just about treasure or rebellion on the high seas. It was about rewriting the rules, even when the world refused to let you. So next time you hear about pirates, ask yourself, were they criminals or the first women to prove that history's rules could be broken? But here's the thing. Anne Bonny's story doesn't end where the records say it does. The court transcript ends with her pregnancy plea. The execution register, silent. No burial, no final note, nothing. Some say she died in that Jamaican prison. Others claim she was quietly released, vanishing into a new life under another name. And a few whisper something even stranger, that Anne Bonny returned to sea, her legend buried under a false identity, waiting to be rediscovered. If that's true, then the empire didn't erase her after all. She erased them. So the real question is this: did Anne Bonny cheat the gallows and live free, or is her disappearance the greatest cover-up in pirate history? Stick around, because in the next chapter, we dive into the conspiracy, the missing records, and the theory that history's most famous pirate queen may have escaped the hangman's noose. History loves to tell us who the villains were, but it often forgets to ask why they fought in the first place. For the female pirates of the Golden Age, their greatest crime wasn't theft or mutiny or even violence. It was daring to live outside the script written for them. The gallows at Wapping, the whips on the docks, the silence of prison ships, all of it was designed to erase them. Yet, here we are, centuries later, still speaking their names. That means their rebellion worked in a way the empire never expected. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Mary Critchett. Women punished, forgotten, silenced, but not erased. Their stories are still with us,